there really seems to be different camps when it comes to gluconeogenesis, the new production of glucose from, different substrates in the body. So I'm curious as to what your opinion is on gluconeogenesis in terms of being demand-driven or supply-driven. So for our listeners, is glucose being made because the body needs it, or is it just being made when someone's eating, a lot of protein or sort of what would be considered an excess of protein?
Yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer. I would like to say, the rider is always the situation. Are we in weight maintenance? Are we in a negative energy balance situation? Is someone type 2 diabetic? Is someone even type 1 diabetic? And all of those things, I think, can sort of change the answer to the question. So it's not black, it's not white. I think it's gray. But, so my take is something like this. And so I think that the chief thing that people have to realize with respect to protein, and it's not just protein in general, but specific amino acids within protein, are themselves insulinogenic. So if I just gave you, my favorite amino acid because of its role in muscle is leucine. If I just gave you leucine to eat, so first of all, it would taste terrible because it's really bitter. Wait, just leucine, you would get an insulin response, and it doesn't require anything else for that to happen. You don't see a marked change in blood glucose. It just stimulates insulin release. So there's a beta pancreatic response to amino acids. And I think that in and of itself complicates a lot of this sort of, I know a lot of people who favor ketogenesis and want to stay in a ketotic state, then say they eat protein and it kicks them out of ketosis. And, so whatever you've got, either a dipsticks or some sort of breath meter to measure that. And I don't doubt that that's the case. So higher protein or more protein can do that. I do think that that's a little bit situation specific. If you're in energy balance and you're consuming a ketotic diet, I doubt whether that happens. But human physiology is being what it is. Never say never. From my perspective, if you're in energy balance, so the demand for blood glucose is relatively small, and if you're consuming adequate carbohydrate, and so there's really no need for gluconeogenesis, then protein isn't particularly gluconeogenic per se. So it's not a demand or it's not a supply-driven process. In other words, consuming protein doesn't cause blood glucose to spike or rise. If you're in a different situation, if you're in an energy deficit, and particularly if there's a demand for glucose, glucose is held within a very tight range and regulated hormonally really tightly, then I think you could hormonally set yourself up for a situation where consumption of protein would actually drive glucose production. And it may be that it's in an excess of what it is you would need, but I think then counter-regulatory mechanisms would want to push glucose back to within normal limits. But you're in a ketotic state, let's say you're trying to lose weight and insulin is low, maybe you don't get the counter-regulatory response that would cause glucose to come back down. So I think that there are specific situations you can say it is supply-driven when you're in a negative energy balance, and maybe even that ketosis promotes the need for glucose because you might not have enough other gluconeogenic precursors. But I think that in other situations, you could say that the supply of gluconeogenic substrates in the form of amino acids is not, it doesn't drive gluconeogenesis. So I think it's context specific, like a lot of discussions around weight loss and macronutrients and everything, and it's a little more complex and nuanced in answering the question. For most people in a weight maintenance state, and I think probably independent of diet, glucose is, protein does not drive glucose production. So gluconeogenesis and the need for glucose is not supply driven, it's demand driven. And there's just, if you're in an energy balance state, not a huge demand for blood glucose.
Right. So in the absence of exogenous glucose or carbohydrates coming in, then the body would convert the protein to glucose more readily because it has a need for it?
I think that in combination with being in an energy deficit. So if you're in an energy deficit and you're not giving the body a lot of other glucose or gluconeogenic substrates, and ketosis might be a situation like that. And I know everybody sort of says, oh, well, there's a lot of glycerol around. And I'm like, okay, fine. But there's not a lot of, unless you're exercising, not a lot of lactate and pyruvate, which are that's the liver's favorite gluconeogenic substrate, if you will. But then when you give it enough alanine and glutamine, preferred gluconeogenic substrates, it can shuttle those through the pathway, and if you like, sort of satisfy the body's demand for glucose. But it may overshoot, right? And it may result in a relative hyperglycemia that is not then countered, which usually happens, by insulin, because you're in this ketotic state. So, it's a little bit of dog chasing its tail type thing, but I think there are some nuanced arguments in there.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Never an easy answer, and probably there are people that, after this, they'll pick apart what I said and said, well, here's a paper, or in my experience, and I'm always like, look, that's what I think, but I stand to be corrected on all of this. So.
Right. Well, I think it's just confusing for people because there's no real definitive answer, because you can speak to different protein scientists and there's different ideas, like Dr. Don Layman saying every 100 grams of protein is converted into 60 grams of glucose in the body. And then I'll have Dr. Ben Bickman on, and he refers to research where people in a fasted state will have pure whey and none of it is converted to glucose. So looking to the research for answers is confusing for people.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. One of the concepts that I like, and it's not widely used, came out of a thesis that I read from a graduate student working with Jenny Brand Miller, who I think most people know is down in Australia. And it's really an index to look at foods in terms of their ability to, I think, what's the name of the index? I'm trying to remember. It's a FF.
Oh.
Yeah, the food FII, sorry, the food insulin index. And so, in other words, if a bolus of glucose, much like the glycemic index, is sort of at the top of the heap, if you like. If I ate a chicken breast, how would it rate compared to glucose, pure glucose? And I think, the answer that you gave from Don's perspective is an interesting one. I think that there are some protein foods that can drive an insulin response, obviously, and can result in a little bit of glucose production. No question. I think there are other ones that, like a chicken breast, for example, I'm not sure you do get a massive glucose response. You might get an insulin response, but I don't think you get a substantial change in glucose. So from an insulin secretion standpoint, you could score that chicken breast relative to glucose as saying, well, it's not zero. But it's not, Don might suggest protein foods that might have something like a score of 50 or 60, and there probably are some. Whey might be one, I don't know, but food like chicken, I would suggest, is probably closer to about, 25 to 30. So you might get some glucose production. Whether it would cause hyperglycemia, I doubt, but it would give you an insulin response. No doubt about that.